the end.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. Now we've got comments by Neri Marsili and Jessica Kaiser. Jessica's coming to us from the University of Leeds, and she has several papers in the philosophy of language, and we're really looking forward to your comments. Go ahead.
Thanks. I don't have a visual, so I'm just going to read my comments if that's okay. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to give a little bit of pushback and try and defend a methodology that prefers simplicity. And I think what I'm saying is going to echo what Dr. Sorensen was saying in the beginning of his talk. So I'll be curious at the end if we actually disagree about very much. Okay, so in the beginning of his paper, Dr. Sorensen describes a simple folk theoretic view of lying, according to which lies are characterized by the intention to deceive. So we can call this the simple theory of lying. This folk theory gets passed down to children over generations, Dr. Sorensen suggests, because this uncomplicated characterization of lying is all the simple-minded can manage. I'm not entirely sure, as an empirical matter, whether this is the right explanation for the persistence of the simple theory among non-specialists, or whether the simple theory really captures the folk theory of lying, so I'm not going to comment on that. Rather, what I'm going to do is suggest that there's a different explanation for the persistence of the simple theory of lying among theorists, including philosophers of language. I want to claim that such theorists start off with simple cases, not out of simple-mindedness or a failure to recognize or comprehend complexities, but because it's easier to construct a tractable theory this way. It's common to ignore complexities in theorizing for pragmatic reasons. This methodology involves what Michael Weisberg calls Galilean idealization. In the beginning, you artificially limit yourself to simple paradigmatic cases and construct a theory based on these simple cases. Once you have a tractable theory, you can start introducing complexities into the theory at a systematic rate that keeps the theory manageable. In the domain of philosophy, this sometimes works as follows. We're trying to understand a certain phenomenon like lying. The data that we have about this phenomenon consists mostly of judgments of ordinary speakers. So if we're aiming to build a theory of lying using Galilean idealization, we might start out by limiting ourselves to data about how ordinary speakers judge very simple paradigmatic cases of lying. Then we might look for the most natural kind that characterizes what all these cases have in common, and which gives us the right predictions about other simple cases. In addition to fitting the data, we'd also want our theory to be explanatory. And this, I think, gets at some things Dr. Sorensen said. For instance, we'd ideally want the natural kind we picked out to reveal the features of lying in virtue of which it has the normative properties that it does. We'd want it to shed light on, for instance, why it's often viewed as wrong to lie, but why this rule has exceptions. There's even more that we want from our theory of lying. Though perhaps some theorists are interested in the phenomenon of lying for its own sake, I suspect that most find this phenomenon interesting in its relation to broader theoretical domains, including value theory and the philosophy of language. So in addition to the features I've already mentioned, we'd want our theory of lying to connect up to these broader theories in the right way. For instance, in the case of philosophy of language, we'd want our theory to be a good fit within a viable account of assertion, which itself fits within a broader theory of speech acts, which fits within a broader metasemantic picture, etc. And we want our theory of lying to give the right predictions with respect to the phenomena falling within these broader domains. For instance, we'd want it to provide a principled distinction between lying and joking, or lying and non-literal speech. And this is why I suggest that traditional theorists following a methodology which employs Galilean idealization might have been attracted by the simple theory of lying, according to which it's characterized by the intent to deceive. As Dr. Sorensen notes, in these simple cases, lying seems to be captured pretty well by the intent to deceive condition. It's simple, elegant, and seems to pick out a natural kind. It generates the right predictions, at least in the simple cases. It's explanatory. There are features which explain why it's often, but not invariably wrong to lie to someone. It plays well with broader, independently motivated programs in philosophy of language, such as, but not necessarily limited to, the Gricean program. For instance, it fits well with a roughly Gricean account of assertion. If we think that to assert something is roughly to intend to get your audience to believe it, then lying counts as a simple subspecies of assertion. Lies are just those cases in which the speaker asserts what she believes to be false. It follows that in such cases, the speaker intends to deceive her audience, so this simple theory fits neatly within this broader Gricean picture, in the sense that it's implied by it. And then this picture of assertion, in turn, is linked up to a broader and unified theory of speech acts, according to which they're differentiated by the kind of intentions governing them. And this speech act theory fits nicely within a broader metasemantic picture, which is associated with Grice, Lewis, Stalnaker, and others, which aims to reduce facts about linguistic meaning to facts about the actions and mental states of language users. So in this case, relevant mental states would be intentions. Furthermore, it gets the right predictions regarding phenomena falling within the range of this broader theory, in that it gives us principled ways of distinguishing lying from non-literal and non-serious speech. In the latter cases, the speaker does not intend to get the audience to believe what she says, so her utterance doesn't qualify as an assertion and thus doesn't qualify as a lie. Okay, but I started out by saying that using a methodology that involves Galilean idealizations, we begin by constructing a simple theory, but ultimately end up introducing complexities. But so far, I've only given you an example of how we might construct a simple theory of lying. So what happens when we begin to introduce complexities? Well, sometimes this involves revising the simple theory, and other times it involves rethinking our starting assumptions. Again, our data includes mostly judgments of ordinary speakers. So introducing complexities involves introducing judgments of ordinary speakers about more complex cases, including, for example, the types of cases that Dr. Sorensen brings up in his paper. If our current theory matches this new data, we're in good shape, but sometimes it doesn't, in which case we might make revisions to the theory in order to bring it in line with the new data, or we just might throw out the data. Let me explain what I mean by that. What we want from a theory, at least this is what I'm assuming, is not simply to match the judgments of ordinary speakers. These judgments are not always uniform or consistent and get arguably less so when the cases become more complex. As I've suggested, we also want the theory to pick out a relatively natural kind, to be explanatory, and to play nicely with our best broader theories of language. Unfortunately, though, we can't necessarily have all of these things. I think we usually can't. Maybe I'm a pessimist. And so theory building always involves trade-offs. When we can accommodate the data, that is the judgments of ordinary speakers, by making changes to the theory while preserving its theoretical virtues, we should do that. But in cases where the only way to match ordinary use is to give up on a tractable theory that meets important theoretical constraints, it's better to throw out the data. The intuitions of ordinary speakers are a starting point, and they serve to constrain our theory, but they're not the only consideration in theory building. Ultimately, I'd suggest it's better to have a solid theory that gives us surprising predictions about peripheral cases than a theory that matches well with ordinary use, but lacks the theoretical virtues I've been discussing. Again, though, I'm not saying that you shouldn't revise a theory to fit complex cases. Indeed, many Griceans, including myself, have suggested revisions to the simple view I sketched above in order to accommodate more complex data. This should be done when it can preserve the theoretical commitments, and it should especially be done when adding the complexity improves the explanatory power of the theory. I'm merely suggesting that it should not be done when trading off theoretical considerations with matching judgments of ordinary speakers is too costly. If pre-theoretical judgments always trumped theoretical considerations, we'd still be classifying whales as fish. Given these methodological background commitments, I'm not entirely sure how to respond to the very interesting but complex cases that Dr. Sorensen brings to our attention. I would need to see what we'd get when we construct a theory of lying that aligns with all of that data. Does it carve out a natural kind that can do explanatory work? Does it play nicely with broader theories in the philosophy of language and retain other important theoretical commitments? If the answer to all this is yes, then I think we should take these cases seriously. But if the answer is no, I'm not convinced that the philosopher that prefers the simple theory should be too upset by them. So I'd be curious to know whether Dr. Sorensen is thinking about methodology in the same way, and if he's optimistic that we can construct a tractable theory of lying that both matches the data concerning ordinary use, but is also well integrated into a broader viable theory of language and satisfies other theoretical constraints. Thanks very much. And also thanks so much for Dr. Sorensen for the great paper. I appreciate it. And thanks also to the organizers for inviting me.
Thank you. Go ahead, Neri.
Thank you. So here I have a bit of a summary, the first section of the various slides that were discussed in the paper version, like the written version of the paper that Roy sent us. The cases discussed in the actual paper were slightly different, but it's not a big problem because, as a matter of fact, what I wanted to discuss is the factional lie. So just to lay my cards on the table since the beginning, personally, I tend to agree with Roy about pretty much everything in this debate. So I think myself that intending to deceive is not a necessary condition for lying. Of course, most of the time when we lie, we intend to deceive, but it seems more like a prototypical feature of lying rather than a necessary condition. So what I'm trying to do basically here is play devil's advocate and see if we can say something on behalf of the deceptionist that could save at least some of the problematic cases and explain them away. So just to sum up very quickly what was said about factional lies in the paper. First of all, we consider a sort of raw intuition that this was a genuine lie, so that Mary lied to Georgette and Ted. And second, to support this raw intuition, it was said that we shouldn't be mistaken. We shouldn't think that this is a fictional assertion. It's a genuine assertion. So if you remember, there was a sort of comparison with what happens when an actor speaks on stage. It's not just we're going through the motion of asserting like an actor would do. It seems that at least some people think that some other people are being deceived by the assertion, and therefore it must have some communicative force. It's not a case that can be fully reduced to a case of fiction. So what could the deceptionist say in response to a case like this? First of all, I think that the intention can be challenged. I don't think it's obvious that every single ordinary speaker will have the intuition. And I think that I myself, I'm sitting on the fence a bit, but I have a weak intuition that this is not an assertion and therefore it cannot be a lie. So what could we say to support this intuition? First of all, I think we could appeal to something like a lie to test. So who did Mary lie to in this scenario? First, we might say, well, maybe Mary lied for Ted to Ted, but this wouldn't seem right because, of course, Mary's not even really speaking to Ted, she's speaking to Georgette, so it would be odd to say that. What about saying that Mary lied for Georgette to Georgette? I think maybe some people, we have the intuition that this is okay, so that Mary can have lied to Georgette even if Georgette asked Mary to say what she said. But I think that at least some ordinary speakers will see some tension here between the claim that Mary lied to Georgette and the claim that Georgette asked Mary to say what she said. Anyway, I think this is not the strongest kind of reply that can come from the deceptionist faction, so to say. I think that maybe the way to go to sort of, challenge factional lie is to question the argument that they are not fiction, or at least the effectiveness. So I think fiction is not the only way we can agree on this, in which a speech act that has the surface feature of assertion can be deprived of its force. So there are many contexts in ordinary language in which I can say something that has the surface features of an assertion, even though I'm not really asserting. So I'm thinking of irony, I'm thinking about mere mentions, speech reports, I'm thinking about even some rhetorical figures, hyperboles, metaphors, etc. So I'm just saying there's a wide range, constellations of way in which the illocutionary force of a given utterance can be sort of weakened or even completely removed by some context features of the context. So perhaps we are just in one of these cases, we just haven't pinned down what is happening. Maybe it's not fiction, it's something else. What could it be? Before we go into a possible explanation, I just want to mention that some accounts of assertion that are on the market would predict that the factional lie is maybe not a fictional lie, but at least not a genuine assertion. So first of all, we have Gricean views. Of course, this is not too interesting because Gricean views will always say that we are not dealing with an assertion whenever there is no intention to deceive. So whenever we have a counterexample to the intention to deceive condition, we would have a Gricean that will tell you, well, but it's not really an assertion. So of course, there are doubts about Gricean views. It's just not a surprising fact, right, that the Gricean would say it's not an assertion. What about other definition? So I'm thinking a popular definition today, at least in the debate online, is a version of Stalnaker's definition of assertion coming from Stocke, who says that you assert only if you propose to add a proposition to the common ground, where the common ground is the official common ground. What does he mean by official common ground, Stocke? Well, he's saying the sort of common ground that we are not just opening up to explore a hypothesis, etc., but something that would survive, for instance, is in the next conversation, so that when we meet again, we can again presuppose that that proposition is true. Well, it seems that this is not the case for the lie that Mary told to Ted and Georgette, because if we imagine, for instance, Mary meets Georgette again, they wouldn't take for granted that Ted is going to Brazil because they both know that Ted is not going to Brazil. So it seems that there is no proposal to add a proposition to the common ground in Stocke's sense. At least we're not dealing with an assertion. And maybe even a normative definition of assertion would say something along these lines. So perhaps someone who defends a normative definition can say, well, look, to assert is like to entitle your audience to criticize you if what you say is false. And again, maybe Georgette and Ted are not so entitled to criticize. Anyway, my point here, a story can be told for many accounts of assertion that we are not dealing with a genuine assertion. I want to end with a mere conjecture. So like, what could be going on in these cases if they're not assertions? Perhaps I want to suggest what is going on is that some sort of extraction is in place and the audience is aware of the extraction. So there is a sort of scripted assertion and the audience is aware that it's scripted, and it would be sort of foolish for the audience to treat this as an assertion in the thick sense. So compare these two cases. Suppose I say to my crush, kiss me and I'll buy you that motorcycle, or tell me you like me and I'll buy you that motorcycle. So apart from the absurdity of such a proposal, if my crush kisses me, it would be foolish of me to think that this kiss expresses affection towards me, or that has any meaning beyond going through the motions of the kissing. In the same way, it seems that if my crush said instead the words, I like you, it would be foolish of me similarly to infer from that there is an expression of affection, or that it has any meaning beyond going through the motions of telling me that they like me. So perhaps there is something like, a problem with asserting what has been extracted when your audience is aware that it's been extracted. And this is not a problem, it solves also, of course, not everybody is on the same page in the example of Mary, Ted, and Georgette, but it seems that the audience can be aware even if if not everybody's on the same page. So it would also not necessarily imply that there needs to be common knowledge for this requirement of awareness, lack of awareness that the speaker is acting on a script. So this could explain what goes on in the factional lie. And perhaps, and this is what I think is interesting, and I wanted to hear what Roy's opinion is about this, it may explain why we have some resistance on some other counterexample that have been proposed by Roy in the literature. So there was a lot of resistance about coerced lies, where I point a gun to someone and I ask them to tell me something. It seems in this case, again, I am aware that they are acting on a script, that the only reason why they're saying what they're saying is because I told them not to say whether P, but to say that P. Similarly, there are some cases where there is a bit more indirect extraction. So for instance, I have in mind the case of a soldier speaking in a totalitarian state where it's obvious that the soldier has been instructed to say something that it's obviously false, or the case of the receptionist that you mentioned earlier, that earlier in your work was the case of the butler of Rubinstein, the piano player. Again, saying something obvious like the boss is not at home or the maestro is not at home might happen in a context in which the audience realize that the speaker is only saying so because they've been instructed to say exactly that sentence. And that may deprive in a similar way of assertoric force. Maybe not in a way that is as obvious as the case in which it is the audience themselves that prompted the utterance, but perhaps, it pollutes also our intuitions about these cases. So I wanted to know what Roy thinks about this conjecture. And just to close, I want to clarify what I've tried to do here. I'm not arguing that factional lies are definitely not assertion and definitely not lies. I'm just suggesting that there is some space for discussion here, that the deceptionist could give a reply, and that maybe this sort of rationale for replying extends to some of the other cases that have been presented in the literature. But having said so, I agree with Roy that the intention to deceive doesn't scale up. So when we consider these sort of cases with third parties involved, it seems that we have many counterexamples. So even if we succeed in explaining away this one, it would seem that there is still a long way to go for the deceptionist to prove that it is necessary that for lying you have to intend to deceive your audience.
Wonderful, thank you. Roy, you're up.
Yeah, so I think there's a point of convergence. So when I heard Jessica would be commenting, I made a prediction which has not come to pass. So first of all, I agree with Jessica on like the importance of methodology. And I'm sort of, as Armstrong would say, to the victor go the spoils on many of the cases. And we're seeing from Neary, his intuition is not that clear. It's not clear to me either. I'm ambivalent. What's going on with Neary. Some of the other cases, I do think it's part of what's so disagreeable in some of these jobs, like being a receptionist and so on. There's a lot of this lying for such low pay. So anyway, what I thought Jessica was going to do, and maybe I can entice her to do a little bit, is she has actually a positive analysis of some of these cases in which you're not really making the normal moves in a language game. And I thought, oh, that's where Jessica will go. And so I'm going to concede that, what I'm recommending is like, oh, we have to do like this terrible amputation of the intent to deceive condition, the thing that I so much loved. Oh, I love that leg so much, but now, oh, I've got to cut it off, And Jessica says, well, wait a minute, does it really got any gangrene there? Okay, I agree that you have to take a real hard look before you get rid of the intent to deceive condition. But I thought you actually maybe if you had more time, you would have gone on to a positive analysis of what's going on with Neary. Anyway, do you have any such positive thoughts? I thought it would converge with some of Neary's ideas that, there's a lot of things we do, like the irony, a lot of fancy things you do,
Yeah, that's right. I think that's what I would want to say in that kind of case, is that she's doing something else. But I don't have an analysis of the kind of speech act, because it is a new and interesting thing to think about, so it doesn't fit within my framework of how to think about speech acts when we have something haven't thought a ton about coercion or extraction and things like that. So I don't have a positive proposal, but I do know that I would want to resist that it's an assertion, as both of you have predicted that I would say. But I think it's really interesting, and it presents a challenge to me to try and fit this case within the kind of speech act framework that I prefer. and to see if that can be done. And if not, I'm not convinced that I need it to qualify as a lie, but I am convinced that I need to be able to say something coherent about it. So that does present me with a challenge there.
Yeah, I thought also, so your account, some of your critics say, oh, well, we'll just have too many kind of idioms sort of going on, that that we don't really have a language game hypothesis, that you just have so many of them going around and they wouldn't be systematic. And I thought that this was like a furtive motive, because you'd want to do something where if you could kind of recurse in some way, where I can get another kind of what appears to be one kind of language game. It's not really that language game. And theater seems to be pretty good for you that way, because it looks like it gets fancier too within the theater. There's all this kind of, self-referentiality that starts to happening and sophisticated, and you can somewhat predict in a way what's going to happen, new developments in it. Anyway, so it seemed that your analysis seems to be, your early comments seem to be kind of motivated. They're sort of challenging, but you have a kind of path into those kind of cases.
Right, that's right. Yeah, I think it's nice when you can, it's kind of the Galilean methodology. You can use your basic tools to handle more complex cases. You have to make your story complex, but you're in good shape if you can at least use the basic tools, which with Gricean would be intentions. But yeah, I have to think more about this. And I think the reason I wasn't defending my views so much is that I'm not so much committed to a theory of lies as I am committed to like the more basic Gricean framework. So that's really where my commitments are. And it's like, if I can tweak things in order to accommodate this data, then I'd be happy to do that. I'm not so much married to the intent to deceive condition as I am married to this bigger program of philosophy of language that I think has a lot going for it.
So Jessica's like kind of there are two wings in the lying literature. The old wing with the moralists, and then the new wing, Jenny Saul and some other people, and Jessica is a philosophy language wing. And they're interested in the morality, but that's like the minor thing. It's just getting to make your philosophy language work. So just to pass on to Neri, I think, yeah, so some of your remarks fit very well and kind of converge with Jessica. I am concerned about things like sarcasm and irony. So with and so and since I am also from the philosophy of language wing on this literature, I don't have as much inhibition about attributing lies to nice people. And I'm more like the psychology people too, who attribute quite a bit of lying to people. But they're like pretty cool, and pretty mellow about lying. I think partly because they do so much of it in their experiment setting, to manipulate people. They just only people who kind of can make peace with that can be successful in experimentation on people, psychology experiments. So I should mention, and this maybe is just an extra illustration of Jessica's point on the reality. I seriously think, well, maybe what sarcasm is just I say something, I'm lying, but then I quickly debrief you. So, if I take the lie back soon enough before it does that much damage to your plans and your, then it can be just a fun thing to do, and then it may be illuminating. So so some people are ambivalent about it. The people who are a little uncomfortable with sarcasm will heavily mark what they say in a kind of a sarcastic voice, or have other kinds of markers, or kind of an emoji going or something. But people who, if they're from New York, they won't do this, and they deadpan. They won't give you indicators that, and it's disorienting for out-of-towners, like Canadians especially. Canadians come to New York and what's going on, the strange speech. And so many people recoil from saying that, well, what the New Yorkers are doing is they lie a little and then they take it back. I'm more friendly to this now, and so so Neary was looking, well, what do I got? I have to, once I take away the intent to deceive condition, what am I doing with all this other stuff that is handled so well by the intent to deceive condition? I think one of the things I really want to be doing is I'm going to be attributing much more lying than is common, amongst in philosophy, and then also just it's not so bad, sort of, or it's actually good. Anyway, it's a lot of low-level lying. That's the, and so that also means it may even penetrate into some theater that I. Certainly, it was unclear to the people watching early theater what was going on, and so I think Shakespeare would entice more people to come because people are uncertain about what happens if the witches in the scenes say these spells. Will they be struck dead, by God? Oh, and more people would file in because they knew those things would be said. So they was like not clear, if you say, may God strike me dead or something, and if I'm with, maybe God will strike you dead, and then more people buy your tickets. That people had to, it seems, at least in the West, people had to kind of slowly carve out what was going on with theater and with fiction. Robinson, people, early fiction seems like Robinson Crusoe looks like it begins as a lie. And then this defensive maneuvering, and you sort of get a theory of fiction coming out of the defensive, decommitting, from what you said. Okay, so those are sort of my concessions and the thoughts that have been stimulated by my commentators. Thanks, I appreciate them, yes.
Wonderful, fantastic. All right. Well, Roy, thank you so much for this talk. This was fantastic and very interesting, and also very persuasive. I had not previously encountered your work on this, and I find myself convinced. So thank you.
Oh, it'll be okay. Thanks. Great. I very much appreciate the remarks by the questioners and my commentators. Thanks.
All right. Well, bye-bye, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this session of the Cologne Knowledge Router.
That was today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Tune in for the next episodes of Figments of the Brain on our SoundCloud page. It's soundcloud.com/brainfigments, or find the podcast on our homepage at www.concept-phil.de.